Okay, welcome back. We're starting our week on legal issues in human resource management. And today have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Thomas Baker, who is a commercial litigator turned associate professor in the sport management and policy program at the University of Georgia. He conducts research in sport management that primarily focuses on the application of the law to sport. Within that focus, he specializes in how commercial law influences and affects sport marketing, such as legal issues concerning brand image and management, and the use of social media in sport marketing. Additionally, and related to this course, he conducts risk management research focused on preventing sexual abuse in sport and terrorism management at sports facilities. He also contributes to Forbes for sports law topics related to his expertise. Dr. Baker received his PhD from the University of Florida in sport management, where he was a Dr. Charles W. LaPrade PhD Fellow, earned the Clifford A. Boyd Graduate Scholarship Award and the Norma M. Levitt Scholarship. He earned his JD from Loyola University New Orleans School of Law, where he graduated in the top 10% of his class, cum laude, earning the distinction of William L. Crowe Senior Scholar. So welcome, Dr. Baker, and thank you for being with us here today virtually.
Happy to be here.
As we discussed previously and offline on a few occasions, exploring the legal issues related to many of our sport management topics, whether it's marketing, governance, politics, management. This is a very important conversation for all of our undergraduate sport management students. And I know I mentioned to you that we do have a sport law specific course for our the second year students in our program. But we both know that the legal issues related to sport transcend a number of our topics, and particularly sport management when we're looking at human resource management, which we'll talk about today. And understanding law for the students here who are watching us virtually is one of the three imperatives that we've already discussed in week one related to the agency of society. So really saying that, it's our pleasure to have you here chatting with us today. And I'm going to ask you a few questions based on your expertise and that link that we've already talked about. So question number one, in your opinion, what is the most pressing legal issue facing individuals who manage our human resources, whether that's employees, volunteers, or interns in sport?
You know, I would say there are several issues that are really at the forefront right now. Of course, you know, maybe this won't translate as well in 2 or 3 years, but right now, I would say the management of COVID-19 has to be at the center of any conversation about human resource management and the law's application there too. So in the sport industry, you know, we're figuring out right now whether or not we should be even going back to work. Mm-hmm. And if so, what should that look like? And there's so many issues and so many concerns related to COVID-19 management, I think, that, you know, it's just incredible. And I don't even know where to start. I guess you could say, I mean, it comes down to so many sub-issues related to this, whether we're talking about negligence in terms of trying to make sure that you maintain a safe environment for your workers, or we're talking about ADA compliance. You know, I know there's this emphasis on getting people back to work and getting people face to face with their employees. But the problem is, what happens if you have an employee who's in the high risk area, you know, and they suffer from a pre-existing condition that makes them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, in which case, if they can do their job remotely, then you probably need to provide that reasonable accommodation. So managing your employees, managing their health right now is at the forefront. I would say outside of COVID-19, and of course with COVID-19 also, when we're talking about employees, we're not just talking about staff, we're talking about the athletes too. And we're talking about the coaches, and people talk about athletes are fine, they're young, they'll be, you know, they're all healthy. Well, that's not all true. Here in Atlanta, a very healthy athlete, Freddie Freeman, in the prime of his life, in his 30s, and he's a professional athlete, and he got hit very hard with this disease to the point that he said, it scared him. He felt that he was knocking on death's door. So we can't make these assumptions. And this is a disease that a 90-year-old may be able to get and it's just, the sniffles, whereas a 45-year-old could die. I mean, we don't know how it's going to affect. Scientists are still trying to figure it out. And human resource managers have to figure that out now. And trying to determine what's reasonable in these very unreasonable times, I would say, is at the forefront. Another issue I would say that's at the forefront in the United States, your neighbors to the south, is collegiate sport and how athletes are being treated in the multi-billion-dollar, because in the United States it is a multi-billion-dollar activity of intercollegiate athletics. And the athletes, for some sports, better resemble professional athletes than they do collegiate stars. And because of that, it creates, I would say, think like junior hockey in Canada, which I would say is not very, at the elite level, it's not amateur at all. It's very professional. And I would say we have something very similar, except even more popular, in America with collegiate sports. So that's a big issue that we're dealing with now. And are these labor, or how they should be treated, or are they, amateurs? And so that's a serious concern. Internationally, I mean, there's always concerns related to in soccer or football, transfer fees and transfer management is another pressing issue. And of course, how employers manage intellectual property and name, image, and likeness rights in these, as sport becomes more commercialized. That's another pressing topic. But those are just a few that are off the top of my head.
Yeah, and two things that I want to draw in from that. The one is coming to the point you made about intercollegiate athletes and the tying to some of our hockey players within Canada, is we talk about in week one of the course is just as a human resource manager, understanding who your human resources are. And I think what you're acknowledging here is there's a blur, there's a line. And so that topic transcends from a legal perspective into, are you training an intern or are you training an employee? Like the way you're treating your intern should be significantly different than how you treat your employees from a legal perspective. But that line is often blurred when we're overextending the task that we give to an intern, as an example. And so I like what you're saying regarding what's happening in the US, because I know we get a lot of media obviously up here and we're very aware of what happens in the United States. And we see what's happening with the NCAA. And from an HR perspective, and then now from the legal perspective, it's, well, they are human resources. And how do we function with those human resources in a way that is, one, ethical, but then also you're functioning legally? I think we don't necessarily always think of it that way. So I think that's a really important point. And then the other piece, and it's a question for you, sort of going a little bit off script here, is with the pandemic. So you brought up a really good point, and you immediately said, this is something for now and maybe not the future. But one of the things that I've seen, even in some of the research that I've done, so from HR, when we talk about sport employees, typically, not always, but people are really committed and go above and beyond. So right now what we're seeing is that there are some individuals who are working outside their job descriptions to continue the program forward. So maybe they're working offline and they want to make sure they're doing the best they can, which is, from an HR perspective, when we talk about commitment and motivation, phenomenal. That's fantastic. However, from a legal perspective, that has a lot of implications for someone who is doing something that is outside of their job description. I might be overextending, but can you comment on that, Dr. Baker?
And I want to comment, because I think that question lends well with what we were talking about before in terms of how we identify our human capital too. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's important, when people talk about human capital, sometimes people freak out because slaves. No. No one's saying you own the humans. No one's saying you own the humans. What we're saying is that they're investments. So in that sense, I think it's actually a good term to use, because you're saying you're investing in your employees and you're recognizing them as assets. And I think in that sense, it can be, rather than liabilities, in that sense, I think, the term human capital, which has been used in professional settings for eons, makes sense.
Yeah.
But understand that, what I think often gets confused is that in law, and this is true whether we're talking, the Canadian system and the US system are so very similar. And, and I have a little bit more, I guess, relation to the Canadian system in the sense that I was trained at a law school in Louisiana, which does both common and civil law, and Canada has Quebec, where Louisiana and Quebec are like the same, so how they're treated legally is very similar, except, maybe the Quebecois, did I say that right? Quebecois?
Yeah, Quebecois.
Maybe they have a bit more uniqueness to them. But the point, what I'm trying to say is, you can call something, and it doesn't mean that's what it is.
Yeah.
All right. So the fact that the employer labels a job, a function, or an employee as something doesn't mean that that's what they are in reality.
Yeah.
So you might be trying to get around paying certain people certain amounts. You might be trying to get around workers' compensation. You might be trying to get around having to provide certain benefits or certain sort of protections. And you can call them interns. You can call them amateurs. You can call them many different things. But it comes down to, what task are they doing? And are they doing, and what type of control do you have over them while they're doing that task? And there are a variety of other factors that courts will use, but just understand this, and that's that the court will disregard your label to get into the truth of what is being asserted. And they will look at it, the facts, objectively, to determine what this person really is and what they're doing and what they should be doing, and whether or not your conduct in managing them is reasonable or unreasonable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's how it's actually playing out rather than what you want it to be in terms of the label. Yeah. And I think that's where again, it comes back to this importance. I mean, we have one day in this course on the legal issues in sport, but it's transcending all of the topics that we, as we move through, saying, okay, we have to recognize the 3 types of employees that we're talking about in general: employees, volunteers, and interns. But then we come into all these topics that say, okay, now we have to understand whether or not it's what we intend as sport managers from a legal perspective. Is this operationalizing itself in a way that is in line with common law, or whatever the standard is that we're using. So no, I appreciate that. And I think that example is fantastic, even just looking at how we want to see athletes and how they're actually functioning are sometimes 2 different things.
And Professor Kerwin, you got to keep in mind this. Sport as a profession is still a relatively new concept.
Yeah.
I mean, this idea of professional sport is still, believe it or not, I know our students are going to be sitting there going to be like, what are you talking about? All my life, this thing has existed. But but when you compare it to like being a lawyer or being a professor, which we can go back, to the time when people, a long time ago, whereas the idea of being a professional athlete didn't really become viable, until like the 70s, and it didn't become a serious thing that the mass within both in all of North America were like, this is our career choice, this is what we want, until like the 80s. And a lot of these jobs around athletics at the highest level and even the lowest level, they didn't exist 20-30 years ago. And our field of sport management is also very young. This is a relatively new area of study. And the reason why is because it's a new career path. And as such, a while back, like let's say we're in the 60s and even the 70s and maybe even the 80s, a lot of people wanted to work around sport, and the industry could take advantage of that. And they could basically get a lot of free labor. And I think that our industry is still trying to, in some ways, live in that past by maximizing, the desire that people have to be around sport, but at the same time, having to transition to this reality in the sense that, okay, just because you can get somebody to do something for you for free doesn't mean that it's a smart thing to do.
Yeah, 100%. And that, I think that's a great way to put it. Doesn't mean that that's right and or the smart thing to do. Absolutely. So I guess we've kind of alluded to it, but what do sport managers often overlook from a legal perspective when they're managing their human resources? So are there specific things that you've seen either in your research or your experience where we see that this is a common gap where either they don't have the training or they just don't see it?
You know what? I think my professional experience, they see it.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever there's a problem, it was seen.
Yeah.
But it was overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
It was ignored.
Mm-hmm.
It was, well, I mean, we want to give benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
We want to believe in the people that we work with whom we work. We want to believe the best in people sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are some legal problems where people look the other way.
Yeah.
And one of the examples that I give to, especially to younger professionals who are working in this industry, they need to understand that just because they report something up doesn't mean that that problem is no longer theirs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in this situation, like look at the graduate assistant who was at Penn State University and walked in on an assistant head coach in a very inappropriate situation with a child.
Mm-hmm.
And it was obviously, I'm sorry, I'm gonna trigger warning.
Mm-hmm.
I'm about to get into something that's very graphic. It was a rape.
Mm-hmm.
And this graduate assistant saw a coach raping a young man,
Mm-hmm.
and he reported it to the head coach, Joe Paterno. And he thought, well, that's it. That's done. And they said, we'll take care of it, right? Well, that GA at the time, his career has been ruined by this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, now that's an extreme example. That's an extreme example. But it's one in which I think I have a lot of sympathy for that graduate assistant in the sense that he saw something, he reported it, but he wanted to believe, he's like, I don't know what I saw. That's human nature to want to reject what seems objectionable and we, no one wants to create waves at work. No one wants to cause trouble at work. But sometimes you need to realize that, the best course of action is the most uncomfortable. Yeah. It is the one that means that maybe you need to terminate an employee who is underperforming. Maybe it's a situation where you see someone and they're giving you indicators that they might be unfit for this job, whether it's their performance or whether it's their behavior, and you want to give them another shot. You want to give them another chance. Maybe it's a situation where you overhear, well, that's just Bob. Bob says some jokes that are a little, blue at times, but he's a good guy. I've been over to his house. I had a barbecue with him. That's Bob. Mm-hmm. In reality, no, yeah, but Bob can't behave that way at work. Mm-hmm. And it's overlooking things that you should not overlook, I would say, is a serious problem. Or, reporting things, but just doing the minimum and just trying to run away from the things and say, hey, that's someone else's situation. You can see even in those situations, if you don't take your responsibility to the company and to the people you serve seriously, and you prioritize relationships at work above doing the right thing, that is when I think people get into trouble. And it's not easy doing the right thing at work. It's not easy taking a stand at times. And it is a judgment call often. So, but I do believe that in just about every situation, there were indicators and the person saw them and they just decided to not take them as seriously as they should.
Yeah. And again, it comes back to when we talk about some other concepts. So if we're tying into, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, we really elevate the idea of task and social cohesion and the power of sport to bring people together, which I completely agree with. But I think we also have to be open-minded to say that also breeds some negative behaviors. So exactly what you're saying. So there might be high social cohesion because we all get along and we're friends and we have barbecues after work. But then if something negative is to happen, something illegal is to happen, in that case, you might be less likely to report or do something because these are my friends. I can't go behind their backs. I can't, and that in a way is very problematic. I'm not saying necessarily that's happening in Penn State, but those are the pieces of the cult.
Hmm.
When we talk about organizational culture being so great and people trust each other, but then I think we need to have a little bit of a critical lens to say, well, then sometimes things happen that shouldn't, and we're just not comfortable stopping them because we're such a close-knit group. And not to say that we can't be friends, but it's just, I think we don't really ever take that critical view of things like culture and cohesion, and it's more, they're always looked as a positive when in some ways they lend themselves to what you're talking about.
Absolutely, and I think that deference and respect can be a problem too. When it's
Mm-hmm.
anything taken in the extreme it can be a negative. You,
Mm-hmm.
like getting back to that Penn State example, that GA, he had a lot of respect for Joe Paterno, the legendary head coach, whose statue has since been removed from Penn State's campus,
Yeah.
and he had a lot of respect for this. And well, if he says he's handling it, he's handling it, you know. And that's another example of that. Like, hey, you know, and for younger employees, it takes a lot of, it's not easy, you
Yeah.
know, because, you know, especially when you're just starting out, you just want to do what you're told.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need to question your orders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, these kind of, I mean, everything you're saying is always filtering ideas through my head, because what we talk about in this class is this notion of the intern. And I mean, this juxtaposition between what we communicate on campuses is it's really important to network, and you have to create this amazing network so that you can get a job in the field, and this is what you use your internship for. So the likelihood of someone feeling they have the power to say that something's going wrong in their internship or inappropriate in their internship, we've then now created this culture where we're telling people how important those internships are. So I think that, and then that's just another example. So a lot of things are spinning through my head when we start saying, okay, now from a legal perspective, what is this culture creating?
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe individuals who do not feel like they have the power to speak up if something around them is happening that's illegal or unethical. And
And
again,
I do think one of the benefits, sorry to interrupt, but one of the benefits of living in the time we're living in, I think with the social movement that's going on, I think throughout the world, not just in the United States, is a global phenomenon right now, where I do think the youth of today and the generations that we're teaching now and the generations behind them, I think are going to be more vocal.
yeah.
I do think that they are realizing that they have voices, and
Mhm.
that they're feeling more entitled to use them. And I think that could be a good thing for society.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the last question that I have, we've kind of gone in this track anyway, but you've conducted a fair amount of research on preventing sexual abuse in sports specifically. And again, for students, this may be a triggering topic. So Dr. Baker, thank you for acknowledging that previously. And for those continuing to view, what are some of the ways that sport managers can proactively adopt HR practice or policy that can potentially help mitigate some of these issues?
Yeah.
Again, the emphasis here is on safe environments for everyone, the consumer, the employee, the fan, the members of our sport clubs.
I think from my research, and I'll synthesize into like three themes that in particular, and granted, I found some factors that should be considered, but there are three themes that I think overarch those factors. One would be one has to be supervision. Okay, so as a sport entity, you can't just trust these coaches. I mean, we
Mhm.
saw what happened with Canada's junior hockey. What was
Mhm.
that? Was it in the 90s or early
Mhm.
2000s?
Yeah, the
Where
Sheldon Kennedy case. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
Sheldon Kennedy. And I mean,
Mhm.
you had this iconic coach, iconic, very similar to Joe Paterno, except Joe Paterno wasn't doing what was, was engaged in the violence. But
Mhm.
you have this iconic coach, and people just didn't know. Just let them do what they do.
Yeah.
Don't look the other way. Just
Mhm.
let them get out of their way. And these coaches, and I think in our industry, they become so powerful. these coaches become so very powerful. And people often, when they think of sexual predators, they think of the guy in the trench coat who looks, like he looks like he might be a pervert. In reality, that's not true. These people come in all shapes and sizes, in all sexes, and all identifications, and they are often very charismatic.
Yeah.
And they use sport to as their bait. They use sport as their hook, and they know that they can hide behind these personas. No one's going to look at them, and they have access to young children or young adults that they can influence with their power and with their charisma. So I think, just because a coach is charismatic, just because he has a family or she has a family, just because a coach is very successful doesn't mean that you should give them carte blanche. You need to oversee what they're doing. You need to have practices and events supervised. So supervision is one thing. I think that you need to make sure that there is proper supervision. And as part of that, you need to have policies in place that govern reporting and how coaches are to interact with those who they oversee. You need policies in place that create a climate to where anytime there's a report, is going to be welcomed. You need to create a culture around sport. We need to where people feel that if they see something, they can say something, even if it's against their coach. We need to create a climate to where I don't buy into the believe all women or believe all people type of argument when it comes to sexual violence reporting. I do sexual violence research. That's going too far. What you need to do is respect all people who come to you with reports. If you give them respect and you look into what they're saying and you investigate and you're sympathetic to them, you're empathetic to them, you care for these people, you understand that it takes a lot for them to come to you and report something to you. If you make them feel protected in this process, as you do the investigation, that is what you need to do. And you need to have policies in place that do that. You can't be dismissive. A coach would never do that. This is obviously someone that's upset about their playing time. No, you have to treat every claim with respect. Another thing, getting into this policy component, I think sport has long since needed to do this, but since the industry has not, since you need to do it for your organizations, create a no fraternizing rule or policy. Create a zero tolerance policy for coaches engaging in relationships with the athletes with whom they're in control over. In my university, I am not allowed to have any sort of romantic relationship with any student who's under my charge, any student who I have power over. And I'm married, I wouldn't have any relationships with any students, but at the same time, why don't we have that rule and that policy within coaching? And what we've seen is through the research shows that often what these coaches do is they normalize their behavior by beginning a formal relationship once that athlete reaches adulthood. Now, they have abused the athlete for years. Then they legitimize their abuse by marrying or engaging in a prolonged relationship with this person. And then they drop that individual after a little while and they begin the new process with a younger athlete. This happens repeatedly. This is a trend. And we need to have rules and policies in place that prevent coaches from having any interaction with former or current athletes under their guard, under their watch. And some people might say, well, what if they fall in love? But no, because you need to understand that the coach to athlete relationship is not dissimilar from a lawyer to a client, a physician to a patient, a teacher to a student. There's a power dynamic that elevates the coach in the minds of these people. And they have I like to liken the relationship to a parent and a child relationship, because there can be that type of influence, that type of positive growth, that type of learning, that type of mentorship. And because of that, it can lead to romanticize. The athlete might romanticize the athlete sometimes, especially if they come from a troubled background where maybe they don't have a real mentor in their life other than this person. In that situation, that dynamic can be taken care of. It can be abused. Now, the third prong, other than policies or trend, that I would recommend would be, especially in youth sports, getting the parents involved, getting them there, meeting with them, talking with them. And you need to tell them, like, listen, you're our eyes and ears too. We want you to, if you see something that doesn't seem right to you, that seems a little off, bring it to our attention. We'll look into it. Activate those parents, but you need to do it in a way to where parents need to understand that they need to be looking out for the safety of their children, not just their athletic success. Because sometimes the parents become all starry-eyed with these coaches as well. So that's another thing that needs to be done. And so I would say, the supervision, try to make sure that young children are never really alone with any single adult athlete at any point in time, that there's always multiple eyes around as much as possible. Make sure that there's supervision if you can. That's prong number one. Prong number two, have policies in place for reporting and how you deal with those reports, and creating a culture, a climate to where you're welcoming of reports and you take them seriously and treat people with respect. And the other one I would say is mainly get the parents involved and get them on top of the situation, and understand that you're limited in where you can be at all times. So you need to rely on the eyes and ears of others.
Absolutely. And this is where, and I'm glad this is kind of where we're coming to a close. It's this notion of what we've talked about throughout the class, is that you have to prepare for what could be. So proactively putting these policies and practices in place at first might be slightly different or uncomfortable for people. But if it's emphasized that it's for the safety of participants, always emphasizing safety, and that it's done consistently, then this is just the way we function. And so it's, because I know I've heard, and I think we talked about this when we spoke last week, is when I go over the notion of, okay, well, let's interview our volunteers as a way of maybe having a safeguard to ensure that the people we're bringing in are, that we're comfortable with them, there's no red flags. And then you get the pushback from, well, that takes a lot of time of managers. Yes, it does. But if you then set the precedent for, we're taking that time, we're allocating that time for the safety of our participants. If someone decides they don't want to be involved, then maybe that's not someone that you want in your organization. So, these are hard questions or hard steps in some cases, because it does take time and resources to develop policy and make sure that it's implemented consistently. But what we're saying here is, from a legal perspective, you're ensuring, and ethical, you're ensuring the safety of people under your organization.
And background checks are not fun and easy to do, but they have become easier over because of technological advancements. They're now very affordable. And a lot of youth sport organizations have, and I haven't really gotten into that because often they are mandated right now under many of these umbrella sport associations. They require background checks, but understand the background check isn't everything. Because if someone hasn't gotten caught, it's not in the background check. And if they have gotten caught, but they got away with it, and that might not be reflected either. So in addition to background checks, you need to do those calls. You need to call, you need to check, you need to check references, and check references that the person doesn't list. This is an HR. I don't want to speak. Know the law within where you are. So check where you are, but understand often HR groups will say, oh, you can't do that, because, I think often, human resource management, a little bit of legal knowledge can be dangerous too, because if you extrapolate from it and you're making hard policies based on inaccurate information, that could be a problem. Understand that your HR rep is not a lawyer, more than likely. So you need to understand what the law is and what it really permits and what it really requires. Dig a little deeper, because sometimes people say, oh, you can't do social media searches on potential volunteers or employees. Oh, you can't call people who aren't on the reference list. Well, you need to check within your jurisdiction, because it is jurisdiction specific. You need to check your province, to see what the law is at where you are, to see if that's the case. Because honestly, I believe in doing all that stuff that often HR tells you can't do. I believe in, especially when there are children involved. And when I mean the stuff you can't do, I mean going above and beyond the background check, to check sources. Hey, you know what? I think I know someone who used to work with that organization. I'm going to give them a call and I'm going to say, hey, what are your thoughts about this person? If this is tolerated where you are working, then do it. Go the extra distance, because understand that these people who are working for you, even in a volunteer capacity, if they have access to children, if they do something wrong, that's going to affect everyone within the organization. Everyone's going to be in trouble, not just that person.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes back to when you say know the law of which you're operating within. So whether it's Ontario, a different state, a county, depending on where you land. I mean, these are things that we need to be aware of. And that's where I come back to. If I do full circle week one, when we said the agency of society, it's your responsibility as a manager to understand the law that governs where you're working so that you can make these effective decisions. And so when we say, yes, wonderful, the second year law class is there, but I think it's also being mindful of how the law is going to impact a lot of your functioning as sport managers, whether it's managing human resources, marketing, how you communicate through sponsorship. You have to understand the law in order to make sure that it's effective. Fantastic. I'm mindful of the time, and I know, Dr. Baker, you're very busy, so I do want to thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm sure if I have any questions from students, we'll certainly follow up with you if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely. And if any of your students have any, you can give my email address, tab3@uga.edu, and you can follow me at Dr. Tab3 on Twitter. I'm here for any questions or concerns.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks.
Yeah.